All right, friends, welcome. It's good to see you all and have you all here. My name is Sam Heath, and this is the Evangelical Network of EJUSA's webinar series called In the Movement, meaning the justice movement. And our goal here is to engage people who are in the justice movement and to engage and to elevate their work. So my role with EJUSA is I'm the manager of our Evangelical Network. And EJUSA is a national group, and our goal and our hope is to end the death penalty. It's a huge piece of what we do, and to talk about and to bring others into a conversation in a space of action of what does it look like to respond to harm and violence without centering punishment, police, or prisons. And the Evangelical Network's role in that is to have those conversations with Christians, with churches, with Christian organizations, and to see what their justice needs are and to partner with them to be able to help and meet those. So we're going to be talking today about the death penalty movement, especially and specifically, and its images. It's a whole story in the death penalty movement of how it has captured images of these things. And one thing we'll talk about is what those images are, what is considered best practice and not with regard to images. But we have Scott Langley here today. So I'll intro him and give a little bit of a lay of the land of the death penalty movement, and we'll jump into things. So Scott is a recent friend, but has been in the movement in this world for a long time. He's a photojournalist, and he's put together something, and he's over 2 decades into it now, called the Death Penalty Photography Project. And a lot of what we'll talk about will build towards what that compendium of photo is. So I know Scott was with Amnesty International for about 13 years and then moved into helping co-found and co-direct death penalty action with Abe Bonowitz. And we'll talk about all of those things. First, Scott, welcome. You're back from some international travels, and thank you for giving of your time to talk with us.
Thank you, Sam.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat. I never want to assume that everybody is at the same place of death penalty and the movement. So let me give just a little snapshot of where things are. And also, Scott, as you talk, thread through kind of where the movement is with things right now. But big picture, within the United States, we have the death penalty, both within the military, at the federal level, and at the state level. 23 states plus DC have repealed, which leaves obviously 27 states that still hold on to the death penalty. Virginia, my home state, last year was the most recent state to repeal the death penalty and the first former Confederate state to do it. So we're hoping that was a fulcrum moment for things that are happening. Since 1973, the modern era of the death penalty, 190 people have been exonerated. Or another way to put it is 190 people who were innocent were almost executed. And those are just the ones that we know about. We're talking about execution since this country's began. It's about 15,000 people that we have record of that the government has executed. Last night was November's 5th execution, which is a lot for a single month. So it is a weighty moment and month within the movement. And there are things happening within it that are really unique. I think about Oklahoma. Oklahoma has scheduled 25 executions over the next 2 years, and there are 3 executions into this execution spree. And that is something that is really unique. And one bright spot of hope are the number of Christian groups that are around that coalition within Oklahoma, partnering with all sorts of groups of other faiths and no faiths to call for a moratorium and to oppose each of those upcoming individual executions. So for Christians, as we think about this, this is significant. We talk about in these spaces sometimes, who is it that we worship? And for Christians who worship Jesus, this is someone who was arrested, someone who was incarcerated, someone himself who was executed by the state. So that at minimum can call and should call Christians to think about the death penalty in some different ways. Scott and I will talk for about 40 or 45 minutes, and we always want to save time at the end for a Q&A. So if you think of questions, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A feature, or just make note of them, and we'll come back to those and have some space for those at the end. We're also recording it, so we'll send out a recording of this to everybody who registers, but I'm excited both to hear from and learn from Scott. Your photo, and we'll talk about it, but the photo of the cross above the Texas death house is the main photo for the Evangelical Network. And that was the first time that I came into kind of seeing who you were. But there was one phrase, Scott, on your site, I think it was, and let's start there. I know that you'd said, because this was unique, you're a sociologist by training, but a photographer by trade. So what is that transition, and how do those two things play a role in your work?
Uh, well, first of all, thanks for having me, Sam. I really appreciate
Mhm.
it. EJUSA actually is a long time friend of mine and a group that I've admired over the years. They're one of the few consistent organizations I find in the United States that actually is on the ground in addition to doing the behind the scenes organizing. So I really value the work that EJUSA does. So it's a real pleasure to be here. So yeah, there's kind of these different moments in my life of kind of awareness and finding kind of direction and vision for what I wanted to do. Um, the sociology component comes from the fact that when I was in college, that was my major. I majored in sociology, and by default, through the faculty that were at my university, there was a lot of focus on criminology, criminal justice issues within sociology. And so I kind of had this academic background on sociology. And even though I never pursued graduate work after that, or never went into a specific direct field related to sociology, I still feel that sociology is kind of what informs a
Mm.
lot of the work I do. There's different things that inform me, but sociology is definitely one of them because that is my kind of academic lens in which I view the death penalty in that sense. The photographer and training component is because in the middle of being a sociology major in college, I fell in love with photography. I'd always appreciated photography. I was always taking photos of things my friends and I were doing, but it was kind of almost through accident. I started taking photos for my university's daily newspaper for the yearbook, and I just fell in love with it. And at that point, I just gobbled up as much photography classes as I could fit into my schedule and doing as much as I could. And then, as you can imagine, graduating from university, a sociology degree necessarily isn't the most marketable degree to have in terms of going into a field without post-grad work. But photography is something that actually has applications in the employment field, I found. And so I went from school to work for a newspaper as a full-time staff photographer.
Okay. Okay. Now, I know you have a faith background within your family. Like, how did that play a role in your activism? Was that something that was always part of your background? Did that just naturally fold into things within college as you moved into the photography world?
Yeah, it was real interesting because I grew up really active in the Methodist church. My mom's an ordained Methodist minister and was always involved. And I went to Southern Methodist University in Dallas. I grew up in Texas. I was born and raised there and lived there until I was almost 25. And so, being raised in the Methodist church had a huge impact on the way that I viewed what it meant to be to love our neighbor and to love our enemy and be kind to each other. And for me, that really played out in kind of a service sense. Like I was always involved with the service components of my church. And in college, the campus ministry, doing service projects, spring break mission trips, summer service trips, volunteering in different capacities with different groups in need, the homeless, people, in different economic, situations to where like we were tangibly, assisting people in that service component. But like through all that, there was never any sort of political lens, I guess, of what service meant in the church. It was kind
Mm.
of like, this is what Jesus called us to do. And so therefore, this is what we should do. And I was never really brought to a viewpoint of maybe we should also be challenging the systems that were perpetuating some of the suffering and some of the poverty around us. And so I got politicized, I say, in college, through just the nature of some of the friends that I met, some communities I was a part of, and to where I kind of took that next step of applying faith, not just through service, but not through service and direct action, but also through, like a human rights lens of organizing and taking action to try and correct the wrongs of our society.
Yeah, I hear a lot of overlap in how I grew up within evangelicalism of love neighbor and it's important and it's individual. It's what Jesus would do. But when there's that conversation about institutions or systems, often the church would shy away, or like you said, they label it political, and that was a pejorative term rather than seeing what I
Mhm.
think we do now, that so much is political, that's not negative, and all that politics are is how do we live within a society together. And so much of what Jesus did was political, so much of how he spoke was about politics and had political implications, even if he's not talking about something as specific as voting. So
Right.
So it sounds like that wasn't part of the upbringing, kind of seeing that nuance and distinction, but came into things within college.
Yeah. And, I clearly remember this moment where I was starting to feel politicized in the work I wanted to do. And I was the outreach coordinator for my campus ministry, the Methodist campus ministry. So I was in charge of bringing in opportunities for service and outreach to the group. And as I started getting politicized, it was a time where the human rights atrocities that were going on in Tibet were kind of really coming to a boil in the public mind about what China was doing to the Tibetan community, and specifically the religious, the Buddhist religious communities in Tibet. And so I wanted to set up a table at one of our Bible study services to have petitions where people could write letters that we would send on to the leaders in China to say we want to support the Tibetan people in terms of them not facing death and threats because of who they are. And I remember clearly my campus minister saying, this isn't appropriate to have, at our Bible study function. And it was kind of, for me, like there was this divide, like you're kind of saying, like we can talk about service, but we can't necessarily talk about the politics in the institutions that are doing some, pretty horrendous things around the world.
I feel like you're using the term politicized in either a neutral or positive tone, which normally, especially in the evangelical world, to talk about being politicized is typically looked at as a negative thing. So what does it mean to be politicized? Like, how did you see that as a positive continuance or outworking of your faith rather than, oh, it's negative?
Yeah, I guess maybe a substitute phrase of just to say political awareness, so that I was in tune with what was going on politically around me. Not just I'm not just talking about local politics, but like as a concerned person of faith, like I'm wanting to take on the Chinese government. So it's kind of this broad sphere to where being involved in politics wasn't like I was advocating for specific campaigns or candidates on a local level, but kind of this human rights lens. And that's where my love for Amnesty International kind of came into play, because then there became this kind of more of a language and a framework to where politicization wasn't a negative thing, but it was about how do we address people who because of their politics are oppressed by governments and things like that.
Mm-hmm. You were involved in the Catholic worker movement. Did that begin in college? Was that after? And was your involvement with that kind of how they thought about social justice, or was it for a season like being within the Roman Catholic faith?
Yeah. So when I left Texas, I moved to Massachusetts, and when I was there, I met some people who were involved in the Catholic worker movement, and I didn't know anything about the Catholic worker movement. I grew up in Protestant household and Protestant churches, and so when I got brought into some knowledge about the Catholic worker, I fell in love immediately, because the Catholic worker is actually it's a lay movement. It's independent from the Catholic Church, and in particular, there was a community in Boston where I lived. There was actually an interfaith community of people. There was people practicing Judaism, Buddhism, Protestants, Catholics. It was a real kind of multi-purpose, but it all operated on the Catholic worker, Catholic worker ideology, which is that we need to live our faith through action. And so it's not just enough to say that we're on the side of the poor. It's not just enough to volunteer once a month at a soup kitchen, that you need to immerse yourself in the life of service. And so that's what Catholic worker communities largely do, living in solidarity with the poor by operating things like soup kitchens full-time, hospitality houses, food pantries, clothing, just any sort of like support. And it's just lay people who are doing that on their own in a volunteer capacity. And so I was really drawn to that, because I'm kind of an all or nothing person. And so when growing up in the church and hearing these things from the pulpit about, what Jesus was doing, about how Jesus was living among the poor and dedicating his life towards service, like for me, it's like, we either need to do that or you need to not do that. And for me, I felt like we were called to do that, and it was important to do that. And through the Catholic worker, there was an opportunity to do that full time. And so I lived in community where we operated a soup kitchen. We lived among the poor in Boston, and the homeless and the disadvantaged. And like for me, that was a really important way to kind of live out faith, and it's to the full extent that I could through that service, because it never like it just never really felt right for me to, do my volunteering once a month and then go home.
Mhm.
It felt like this needed to be something like, you understand, volunteer once a month and go home.
Yeah, yeah, it's
It
a
was
way
like
of
a
life.
lifestyle, and it's just what I wanted to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I heard about you for your clothes, you were thrifting or making them or dumpster diving, that you're running your car off vegetable oil. I mean, in the sense of I'm going to do these things to engage and to free up funds and time so I can care for and serve to others. So that sounds like dedication.
Yeah, I mean, pretty extreme, in some sense, kind of taking on that voluntary poverty, which I acknowledge comes from a place of privilege. Not everyone can do that, especially after, going to college with, the loans and things that go along with that. But,
Mhm.
for me, it didn't feel extreme. It felt like what we're called to do in a sense.
Hmm. So when was art school in all of this? Because I also know that was some of the beginnings of you engaging death penalty in the photos of it, right?
Yeah, well, it wasn't art school specifically. It was an art project that was
Okay.
through a history class. So it wasn't
Okay.
it wasn't an art class. It was history.
Ah,
I
even better.
Yeah, it was interesting because I told you I studied sociology, but when I was signing up for my classes for my senior year, I had friends that said, "Hey, have you heard about this human rights class through the history department?" And I was like, "No, I haven't." And they said, "You should really take it. I think that's like right up your alley," because people saw me moving towards like this kind of human rights approach to activism. And so I signed up for the class as an elective, and this class was called Human Rights and the American Dilemma. And so it traced like a long history of our country's founding, of like the human rights atrocities that we either directly participated in or we kind of stood by and allowed to happen around the world. Not doing more during the Holocaust, the use of our own, genocide of indigenous peoples and slave trade and all those things. So this is like this really heavy class of all these human rights components.
Mhm.
And in that class, we had an art project, and the professor asked us to take one of those human rights issues that we were studying in class and present an art project based on it. And he's like, you can do anything you want. Some people do collages. Some people, have skills to draw or paint. You can do whatever you want. If you don't have any art skills, you can just make like a mix CD or a playlist of human rights music. And so, like for me, since I was in love with photography, it was clear that I should do something with photography if I'm going to be given an art project. And when I looked around at the issues we were covering, one of them was the death penalty. And as I said, I grew up in Texas and I was going to school in Texas. And at that time, that was when we hit the peak of executions in the United States. This was 1999. And there were 98 executions a year that year, and half of them were in Texas. So these, executions were happening at a very rapid rate. There was at least one a week at that time. And so it was easy for me to see, like, if we're talking about human rights issues, there's literally something happening here, in my community of Texas that I could, you know, incorporate with the photography part of that art
Mhm.
assignment.
Okay. And I'm going to share my screen because I want to show the photo that came out of this, right? Of the cross above this death house. And I'll show it on our website because I want to I want to show people and give credit
Yeah.
here. But you go to our website and there it is. And again, when I came on at EJUSA, I saw this photo, was struck by it, and saw down there at the bottom your name associated with it. And you've told me some of the story of how this photo came about. So what is this and why is this so significant to the movement?
Yeah, it's interesting that that's the photo that you mentioned earlier and are showing now, because that is literally the first photo I took in this project. This project's been going on since 1999. Tens of thousands of photos I've captured over these decades, and that's literally the first one. So maybe there's something to say that you get it right the first time. I don't know, but so for this art project, I decided to go stand outside of the execution facility in Texas. And so I went there with my camera. I'd never been there before. I didn't know what to expect, but I just kind of took it upon myself as this assignment for the art project to just go and take photos of whatever was outside of the prison. And when I arrived, I looked, and there's just this brick wall and there's barbed wire. It just looks like a prison. And I looked up and I see that cross like mounted, literally on the death house that was where these executions were happening. And I was I was struck. I mean, as a person of faith, I was struck by I guess it felt like irony to me, because the cross is one of the oldest symbols of the death penalty that we have, and here it is mounted on top of a facility that is about to carry out a modern day execution, which at lethal injection is what was happening. But to kind of have the kind of the irony of like why they would. I mean, in a way, it's not ironic, right? Like the state is showing, like, hey, this is where we're killing people. Here's a symbol of death, and we're going to put it right here on top of the building where death is happening. But also, brings into these questions of like, what about separation of church and state and all those things. So for me, it was this powerful image, and that's the one that I took and brought back to the class for the art project.
It's almost an image of, it depends on your perspective of the death penalty, how you see it. I mean, if I feel you could look at this as someone who's supportive of the death penalty and say, look at the cross, this is Christianity sanctioning what's happening right underneath it in this death house. And then, or you could look at it like you're saying of, this is ironic. This does not fit together. If anything, the cross itself is a symbol against the death penalty. And that's one thing that just fascinates me about photos within it, of you could have the same photo that could be used in different ways and for different purposes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's one thing I want to ask about is, not that there are rules, but there are practices within capturing images of the death penalty of, this is or isn't appropriate, or this would be all right, or showing this image or this piece of the death penalty process is okay in this context. What are some of those rules and ways that you've navigated wanting to show what the death penalty process is while wanting to be respectful of both those being executed and those who are murder victim family members?
Right. It's definitely a delicate and very sensitive issue, because in my experience of covering executions, often, I'll find myself outside of the prison with the family of the prisoner. Sometimes I'm outside the prison with the family of the victim, because not all of them always choose or are allowed to be inside the prison to witness an execution, and so they're relegated to the outside. Or even if the person doesn't have a direct relationship with what's happening, there's still a lot of emotion. Like maybe someone's a pen pal, or maybe a prison worker or an attorney. There's all these different levels of connection, and so there's a lot of emotion, obviously, involved. And so, I've definitely been in these situations where I have to. I'm a sensitive person, and so like I kind of, in general in my life, don't like to do things that make people uncomfortable. So the idea of getting in front of someone with a camera and taking their picture during these like traumatic, intense experiences, it makes me pause, be like, is this even like, is this something I should be doing? Is this a violation of their privacy? Is this a violation of their space? So I definitely have gone through a lot of that. And I tell people, especially if I'm talking to journalism classes about my project, I say, to be honest, if I'm going to call myself a journalist, I fail. I have failed repeatedly because I am not taking photos of everything that I could, because often I'll find myself in a situation where it seems inappropriate to take a particular photo. Or to be honest, sometimes I'm in a situation where I'm crying so much I can't even take a photo. Like I can't bring myself, to even, see through the tears in these moments. And so, from a journalistic sense, it's like, all right, I'm not doing a great job. But there are times I think through when I have relationships with the people I'm photographing, then it feels more comfortable, because then I've, gotten consent ahead of time, or at least been able to explain myself on what I'm doing, so that they, know that like my intentions are to do what I do. And it's not for just a voyeuristic, that I'm exploiting their situation.
Mm-hmm. What about the photo that's your background behind you now, since we can all see that? What's the story or background of that?
That was on pretty soon after I got involved in the issue. The federal government was threatening to execute its first prisoner in almost 40 years. And so there were marches and protests in Indiana, where the federal execution facility is in death row. And so there was a march in advance of an execution. And this is a crossroads, literally on the corner by the prison. where we had marched by, and I just saw that image and took it, and then just moved along with the march. There was a big group of people, and I was following them and taking photos. But that image just kind of stuck out to me. I think at that time, these are the early years, I was interested in irony. So like, having the cross over the death house to me felt like kind of an ironic or a juxtaposition of sentiment. And then to see this road sign that says state and then justice also felt like this kind of juxtaposition of contradictory terms in a sense, because, when we're talking about the death penalty and it's about to be carried out, like there's no justice in that, and it's being done by the state. And so anyway, that image for me kind of really encapsulated a lot of my feelings around the death penalty. And for me, just kind of became one of those iconic images to where, it's not dated, there's no people in the photo, there's no, homemade signs, there's no necessarily emotion in it. It's just kind of this dry image that I think for me speaks a lot to what was going on and what continues to go on.
Yeah, of this direction for the state and what they're doing, and justice is in some other place.
You're right.
Those are the deepest conversations I feel like with people in the movement is both sides and across the spectrum, people will talk about justice, but saying what that is key. And some of my richest conversations with people are asking, well, what role is it that you think punishment has within justice? Is there none? Is there some? Is that what it is? But that's so layered and key of what is it that someone is wanting? What does justice look like to them? And then if it's a Christian audience diving into, well, we actually do see what justice is. Someone earlier today was talking to me and saying, if we received raw justice of receiving what it is that we deserve, for Christians and for humans, we know what that is. We know that that's separation from God. So we see justice as something more than just this simple balancing of an eye for an eye.
Yeah. And I think, having it's that little crossroads of like, this is where things are intersecting. And that professor that taught the history class that I took and did this art project, he would ask the question, when it comes to the death penalty, like, is this the best that the state can do? And that's a good, like, open-ended question to ask ourselves, because it's not like you're necessarily articulating your opinion. You're just asking this question, like, is the death penalty, the way it's carried out, is this the best we can do as a society? And that really, like you're saying, opens up this whole conversation, where we can have that dialogue with people who don't necessarily agree with us.
Yeah. You said this a moment ago, and I just saw a question that Alan Johnson, who's a friend and a former journalist, and wrote a book on the death penalty and forgiveness. He was clarifying that cross was above a death house, not above a chapel.
Right.
Yeah. And as you said, the irony of that. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, you didn't always oppose the death penalty. So what was the evolution of that story, of how you got to this place now of opposing it for these very practical reasons and also these reasons of faith? But that's not where you started.
Right. Yeah. I mean, even though I had this background with my academic background of sociology and studying the death penalty, it never really challenged me to take an actual personal position on it. I guess we were just never challenged the students to formulate our own ideological or philosophical, or personal, opinions about it. It was all very fact-based about class and race and deterrence and, theories of crime and delinquency, all that kind of stuff. There was never like that movement to ask us where we stood on it, which makes sense from an academic perspective. But it was actually in that moment of going to the prison and standing outside of it, where I looked up and saw the cross and took that photo, because it for the first time, the death penalty became real, I guess I would say. It wasn't just something that I was learning about in class. It wasn't an abstract thing. It just wasn't a headline in the newspaper in Texas the next day. Because what happened was I was standing there on the sidewalk looking up at that cross, and there's this other photo I have that shows a clock on that same building of the brick wall. And so you can see the minute hand getting closer and closer to that time of execution. Because when you're standing outside, there's not really anything to see. There's like a few prison guards, but you're just kind of like watching. Like for me, I was just watching this clock, and it was just getting closer and closer to that time of execution. And when that minute hand struck that time that we knew the execution would be going forward.
This one?
Yeah, that's it. That's that same building where the cross is. It's just a different angle on it. And so you kind of stand there. This is the Huntsville unit in Texas. And executions happen at 6 o'clock. So this photo was taken at that moment of an execution. And when you stand there, like for me, it just became clear on how wrong the death penalty was, because it was no longer this abstract issue. It was realizing that we're talking about real human life. Like, this isn't statistics, this isn't studies, this isn't history, this is human life. And I knew, in any other situation, if you knew someone was going to be murdered, you would do everything you could in your power to stop it. Maybe not necessarily charging the person that's holding the gun or the knife, but calling the police or something. You would, like, it's our human instinct, when we value life, to want to stop life from being taken. And in that moment, I felt helpless. I knew there was nothing I could do in that moment. Like, I wasn't going to cross the police tape. I wasn't going to charge those doors and somehow get inside that prison. But in my heart, for the first time, felt how wrong this was and how much this was an affront to my faith, to human rights, and to everything that I believed in. Because I didn't even know what that person had done to get the death penalty, and it didn't matter to me. This was a human being, and I felt that no human being should be murdered for any reason. And so it was I left that kind of moment really transformed to for the first time say, I believe the death penalty is wrong. And I hadn't been able to say that before. I even went to a death penalty conference the summer before this, and they were giving out stickers. Amnesty International that hosted it, and they're giving out stickers. I had the Amnesty International logo on one side and said, I oppose the death penalty on the other part of the sticker. And I cut the sticker and threw away the part that said I oppose the death penalty, because it's like, oh, I like the Amnesty International logo, I want that sticker. But I wasn't willing to have the rest of that component, and so it really kind of transformed me in being there on the ground. And that's my hope through my photography. Because not everyone is going to be standing outside of a prison during execution. Right. Like, we all, we're not prioritizing, the average person isn't prioritizing their life to go stand outside of a prison during execution to see what's unfolding. And so it's my hope that my photos can start to give a glimpse to people to experience what I'm experiencing, and hopes that people will be transformed in the same way that I was.
Oh, I mean, that is such a call to proximity. And the desire and the need for that. I was reading a New York Times article last night on the 10 best books of the year that they were saying, and I don't remember which one, but one of them was quoting, and someone said, I'm not going to tell you what happened, but I'm going to tell you how it made me feel. And I feel like that's so much of what these photos do, is it gives someone a proximity that they may not otherwise be able to have, and can provoke emotions and feelings and connections that they may not otherwise be able to have, that can move people into it. And that's part of my story too. One of my best friends was arrested and was in prison for 13 years. And we were friends before his arrest, while he was in, and after he was released in 2020. And visiting him and writing him for those 13 years was wild, and wrecked me, and showed me this is what the prison system is. This is what it does. This is what it's incapable of doing. And that proximity was the key. I don't have a moment. I love that yours is this concrete moment of, here's this moment in time I know that I thought this thing for it, but it was over those years and that proximity of showing me this is what this system is able to do is not what individuals need.
Yeah.
Where did civil disobedience come in to this? Because I know that's been part of your story for different causes and issues. Was that after this moment at the Texas Death House, and what was the arc of that?
Yeah, it was after that. It was actually when I got involved with the Catholic worker that I mentioned earlier, because a component of the Catholic worker that I mentioned, it's not just engaging in direct service to trying to alleviate some of the suffering of the poor among us, but it's also to challenge the institutions and structures that are perpetuating suffering. And so the Catholic worker community has a rich tradition of civil disobedience. And so for me, that felt an important continuation of my activism. It felt like a continuation of my faith. It felt like a continuation of what I felt that we were called to do, which is to put ourselves in harm's way to try and address injustice. And if that means risking arrest, then so be it. And so I began participating in actions to risk arrest for different causes. And the death penalty, I think, was one of the first ones. We got arrested on the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court on the anniversary of the first execution in the modern era, and spent the night in a Washington, D.C. jail, waiting to see a judge, and then went on from there to participate in different things around war and torture and homelessness and things like that. But for me, it's important. It's that proximity thing that you were talking about. Like for me, I needed to be in proximity to that system in which I was against. Because if the Supreme Court is making decisions that I don't agree with, if people are suffering in prisons, then I want to be there. And so that was became a big component of my efforts.
Yeah. I mean, and it's important, I think, for Christians to remember the civil disobedience has a long history. I mean, there were things that Jesus did that were going against the civil society. Again, we know Jesus was arrested and incarcerated. And there are all these moments throughout history, the civil rights movement maybe being the easiest to see, of moments when Christians realized that the laws of this land and the systems that were there could not be undone without some form of opposition. I mean, I think about Psalm 10 and it calling people to break the arm of the wicked. That's not a passive call. There is this active involvement, and it requires, again, this proximity to it. And not just a proximity, but an engagement with it, to your point of not just being beside it, but being within it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's all very true. And also for me, it's kind of a personal spiritual practice in a sense, kind of like fasting, because, when you sit in a jail cell, it gives you a lot of time of reflection. And also, it's literally solidarity with the poor, because when you look around, it's all you see are poor people around you when you're in a jail cell. And so for me, it's kind of an extension of that practice of putting myself in the place where the poor are, and to find our common humanity there in those dark times.
Scott, can you talk some about Troy Davis and that story and that moment within the movement, and your involvement in capturing images and parts of the story around that?
Yeah, it's hard to be succinct about the Troy Davis story, because it's very, it's very long and a painful story, to be honest, for everyone that was involved. But I mean, the summary of it is that Troy Davis was a young Black man who was accused of killing a white police officer, an off-duty police officer named Mark Allen McPhail. And Troy Davis was sentenced to death for the murder of this police officer. It was one of those situations where there's no murder weapon, there was no evidence whatsoever that tied Troy Davis to that crime, yet he was convicted. And then later on, through investigation, it was revealed that there was a lot of errors that brought him to that death sentence, including, the witnesses having lied and no one actually knew who the murder was, and the police had coerced some of the witnesses. So, it's kind of this thing that we see unfold often in the court systems, especially when we're talking about young Black men and, against the police officers. And so, it was this real intense thing where we really felt there was an innocent man on death row for a crime he didn't commit. And there was a worldwide movement that was born around him, largely because of his family. His sister Martina was really involved with Amnesty International, involved with her church, and they just really galvanized the whole. They started in Georgia where this crime happened, and it just like grew from there. It was Savannah at first, and then Georgia, and then the whole United States, and then the world were really paying attention to this one case, because everyone really believed that Troy Davis was innocent. And the government moved forward 3 times to execute him, and they were successful the 3rd time. Troy Davis was executed despite huge doubt about his innocence. And I was involved in the campaign, and also as a journalist, Amnesty International brought me on to document outside of the prison what was happening during his execution dates, the 2nd and the 3rd final one. And so I was there with the family and with the others to kind of capture what was unfolding during those dark hours when you're waiting for courts to make their final decisions about appeals and whatnot. And it was a very intense emotional thing for all of us. And there were so many people involved. There were bus loads. Churches were organizing buses from all over Georgia to bring people to the prison. And it was like something I'd never seen, like in all my work on the death penalty. Sometimes you're there with 6 people and candles, having a prayer service outside of a prison. And then in this case, there were buses being brought to the prison where there was 1,000 people or more, and it was just this very heightened environment. And unfortunately, we lost Troy that night, and it was devastating. And I captured everything I could to the best that I could, and used those photos to tell that story of Troy Davis. And I just yesterday gave a presentation to a college class, and I'll be doing it again tomorrow, where I show the photos from Troy Davis's execution to walk people through like what that experience is, of having hope, holding on to hope that the right thing's going to happen, and then what happens when the right thing doesn't happen, and how we deal with that as a society.
I think with Troy Davis's case, it's helpful to point out that the number one predictor of a factor of whether someone receives a death penalty sentence, of all the things that are measurable, is the race of the victim. And in that case, it being a white police officer is yet another example of that playing a role with how disproportionately the death penalty is applied.
Yeah.
Fast forward to death penalty action. And that started, I think, 2017. And can you talk a little about what that is, the goal of it, and how that continues on and still plays such a huge role on the ground with individual executions in the movement now?
Yeah, so death penalty action was started by myself and Dave Bonowitz. And the idea was actually born in a jail cell. We had been arrested at the Supreme Court yet again on the same anniversary of the reinstate, or the use of the death penalty again. And this was in 2017, and Donald Trump had just been elected as the president and was about to be inaugurated. And there was this great fear that he would reignite the federal death penalty executions. They hadn't been used in many, many years. And so Abe and I started an organization to try and deal with what would happen if Donald Trump resumed executions, and provide some sort of organizing and activism around that. It did ultimately happen. Donald Trump did oversee the execution of 13 prisoners in his final 6 months of office. But prior to that, we were still doing other work, even though that issue hadn't really come to the forefront yet. And so what we started doing was working with organizations around the United States to provide assistance when things were happening. Our first project was going to Arkansas, because Arkansas scheduled 8 executions in the course of 10 days that year. And we just, started assisting the coalition partners around the country to do what we could to assist them in their work around the death penalty, and also fill the gaps that existed. There was a national coalition to abolish the death penalty, and it actually shut itself down this year. And so we try and step in and provide opportunities for action for people. Like everyday people can go to our website, deathpenaltyaction.org, and sign petitions around every execution that's coming up. There's letter writing tools for contacting your representatives. And then we provide online vigils during every execution. We just had one last night because there was a very sad, tragic execution in Missouri. And so we provide a way, in a space for people to come together as a community to mourn, and but also to take action. And so that's kind of what we're doing. We're a single issue organization, and there's not a lot of those left in the country, because there's a lot of work to do and a lot of important issues, but that's the issue that we focus on and care most about.
I'll send to everybody a link to the death penalty action and to other things that we've mentioned here. We'll email out a recording and those links. I often tell people, if you want the most up to date of every execution as it's coming up information, Death Penalty Action's email list is key, and Abe sends out notices and vigils and ways to get involved and petitions to sign, and lets you know that these things are coming up. And it is a really helpful and weighty way to know what's happening within death penalty in the United States. Well, Scott, last thing I'll ask, and then we'll go to some of these questions that have come in, is I know you went inside a death house. I don't know if that was once or if that was multiple times, but what was that experience like, and how did that bring things in your mind anew, maybe that had not come before from outside now moving in?
So I was in North Carolina for a couple of years and doing real intensive anti-death penalty work. I started a Catholic worker hospitality house myself to provide support for the families of prisoners. So there was a place where families could come stay when they were visiting their loved one on death row. We provide shelter, food, and just like someone to sit around the table and talk with. But anyway, as part of that intensive work in North Carolina, I found out that the prison offered media tours the week before an execution. And at the time when I was there were executions happening about every 6 weeks in North Carolina. And so I went with a friend who is a journalist, and we went on one of those tours, and it's literally the warden walking you through the execution facilities. They show you where the visitation happens. They show you the table where they have the last meal. They show you the holding cell where the prisoner's kept before they're taken to the death chamber. They show you the gurney. The warden literally wheeled the gurney. It's on wheels. It's not stationary in the execution chamber. The warden literally wheeled the gurney from one room into the death chamber, showed us how they pulled the curtain to divide the room into two parts so that the witnesses can't see the executioners. You go into the witness room itself where you see the chairs where people watch. So like the warden walked us through everything. And I went and I was taking photos, and I was astonished at just kind of the lack of emotion, in these prison workers. They're just like giving you a tour of their house, and just like, oh, here's where we sit and have our dinner, and here's the bathroom. And it was just such this dry, for me, it was really emotional because like you're in this place of death and you're seeing the whole process and procedure played out in front of you without the prisoner, but you can imagine it. And it just blew my mind. And it blew my mind that the warden that was leading this was a Black man, and three and a half days later executed a Black man on a gurney. And it just floored me. And so I left that experience being like, this needs to be on video. And so I went back a second time during another execution and took a video of the whole thing, to be able to show those images in a different kind of art form to people. But for me, it helped kind of birthed the idea that the project has come to be, which I call a timeline of an execution. So when I do presentations to groups, I walk people through what's happening on an execution night. And so not only am I able now to show those scenes from outside of the prison, like the cross on the death house, people hugging each other in the streets, I'm able to show you the warden moving the gurney into place to get ready. So it kind of creates this kind of a more in-depth picture of like what is transpiring on an execution night, because I feel like it's important for us to know that if this is going to be happening in our names, we need to know what this is happening and what it looks like. And so this is kind of my artistic, journalistic way to show what that looks like.
I'm glad you said of this taking place in our name. And that's a huge piece of how things are for people to consider. Of executions are done in our name and supposedly for our benefit and for our safety. And even remaining passive or neutral on the death penalty will allow those to continue. And for it to stop, it requires active intervention, or else they will continue to be done in our name, again, supposedly for our safety. You also talked about art and your art form, and I'm going to go to one of the questions because it relates to that. And forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name, but Lillian Stitcher Sue had 3 questions, but the last one was, do you think that showing art from people on death row could help people see them as other than monsters and maybe help abolish the death penalty?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's obviously different ways that you can humanize people, and recognizing that the people on death row have skills and they have passions. And I know a lot of prisoners are prolific writers, artists, and just do their own their own things within the prison of being mentors and friends and ministers to those around them. And so like these are human beings, even though people have done awful things, they still are human beings. And so I think those efforts to put out art there have an impact because it helps people relate to them as a human being. And it's not necessarily a strategy that always going to work, trying to get someone, if someone's on the fence about the death penalty or pro death penalty, they're not going to want to entertain these ideas of being like, oh, I'm not going to, appreciate the art of someone who committed, a horrible murder. So it's not necessarily, we're going to move the world to love the prison. For a significant population, I think people, want to understand the humanity. And I believe art is one of those ways that we can intersect with each other.
I think of Terrence Andrus on death row in Texas, and we've corresponded with him, and him being an artist and the art that he has produced while within prison with incredible limitations to materials. There's a lot of different forms of art happening within prisons, but I think of Terrence as just because we've talked with him. And you mentioned North Carolina, and I'll send links to these because I want you all to see these things. But in North Carolina, Lyndon Harris is the head of an arts collective called Hidden Voices, and she wrote a book called Right Here, Right Now, Voices from America's Death Row. And the book exclusively is 99 stories of things from individuals in North Carolina, men on death row, and their life. Some of them are poems, but a lot of these are stories. There's art that's coming out of this dark place. And we see that throughout history. We see that with the Holocaust. We see that in internment camps. We always see art and beauty coming out of these places. And so it's fascinating to see that being both provoked by this and getting at Leon's question, art itself then provoking response from other people and calling them into a space to respond to this injustice and this situation. Another question that came in, this one was from Kathleen Temple. She said, do you consider yourself a pacifist? And do you think there might be someone who should be killed in some sort of circumstance? And do you think Jesus was against killing?
I'm personally a pacifist. I personally believe the death penalty is wrong in all cases. It's never appropriate. And I put a caveat to say that it's easy to say that when something horrible hasn't happened to me or one of my loved ones. If I was ever faced in a situation where, say, one of my children was brutally murdered, I would hope I would remain a pacifist. I would hope I would remain against the death penalty. And the beauty of this movement that I'm involved in is I have role models of people who have been in those horrible places of having to have lost a loved one to murder, and they are still against the death penalty. And they still even advocate for the, rehabilitation and even the, sometimes the release of the perpetrator. And it's really, I'm hoping that I'll hold those people to mind if I'm ever in that situation. But as a principle, I don't think the death penalty is ever wrong. And I can't imagine Jesus ever supporting the death penalty in any way either. When you say, those without sin cast the first stone, it's kind of that call to say,
Right.
We're all sinners. And, so none of us can cast that first stone.
Yeah. Yeah, it's significant of when Jesus is confronted with the death penalty, with the woman caught in adultery, he speaks not of her sin and her crime, but yet of those that are there. And he redirects that focus of, are you worthy and able to bring that? And of course, to your point, the answer to that is no. Another question that came in, this one going back to Lillian, was she said, most Western countries have abolished the death penalty. What makes the United States want so much to keep this particular form of punishment?
Yeah,
and that's true. There are very, very, very few countries in our hemisphere that still maintain the death penalty. Why us? Why this long? What do you think is into that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know all the statistics from my Amnesty International work of, which countries still have it, and the fact we're the only Western democracy in the entire world. Our only allies in this are, mostly Middle Eastern countries or China. So it's like, we don't fit in. Like in the world, we don't fit in terms of like the kind of country that we have, the democratic country we have. And, but, why is that? I think I was just at a World Congress about the death penalty, and I was around world leaders, and I was around like the former president of Mongolia and, the Minister of Justice for Germany and the Minister of Justice for the Congo, like all these people talking about the death penalty from this world perspective. And, this issue came up about US exceptionalism and the fact that our country thinks that we're the greatest country in the world and that the rules don't apply to us, that we're exempt. And we can exempt ourselves from what the rest of the world has said is right. The rest of the world has said the death penalty is wrong. You can't even be a member of the European Union and have the death penalty. It's just regular public policy for most countries.
Yeah.
Yet the United States thinks that those things don't apply to us. International treaties that prevent the use of cruel and unusual punishment, prevent the use of torture, prevent the use of the death penalty. We think these don't apply to us.
Right.
And, that's a problem. I don't have the answer about why that is, but our country has this legacy of violence. We have a legacy of demonizing the other. We have a legacy of oppressing people of color, and it's our legacy, and it's a legacy we're working to try and overcome. And the death penalty is one of these really stark and troubling ways where that legacy plays out in this way that is targeting the poor, it is targeting people of color, and we're doing it in a way that directly violates international law.
Right, regularly. Yeah,
Regularly.
yeah. I'd underscore everything you said, and I'd add to it, for our country, I think fear plays a huge role in it. I think people think that the death penalty is the only response that's available. That's why I appreciate so many state death penalty groups that have alternatives in their name, like North Carolinians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. And those exist. There are other things to do when violence and when harm happen, other than confinement or other than execution. But that fear, it's a fear of loss of control, it's a fear of safety in our country, and our criminal legal system says this is the only option. This is all that we have, to confine and to execute. And that's absolutely untrue. And if we actually want true and genuine public safety, it's happening in other ways, in other places, without those things being at the center. Scott, how can people keep up with you and your work? Again, I'll send out all these links that you mentioned, but what's the best way to engage you and your work?
I think the best way that I always hope people will engage with my work is that I have exhibits of my photos that are printed and ready to display, and I'm always looking for opportunities to show those photos. I'm always looking for opportunities to speak to groups, to share the photos, either by by Zoom calls or in person. I'm happy to travel anywhere and get these images out there to people to see them, and not preaching to the choir opportunities, but going into schools or churches to where people maybe doesn't necessarily agree with it, but to try and open eyes. So I always welcome people to engage me in that sense of extending invitations. My website will be in the chat there, or in the follow-up, of where you can see my photos in more of their entirety. And so I hope that people, will pay attention to the work I'm doing in that sense. And then, as we mentioned, Death Penalty Action is the organization that I started and work with, provides opportunities for action. And so I hope people will join up with us to continue taking action.
Great. I'll put death penalty photo in the chat, just because I really want to make sure people see that and engage that. I think seeing these images and hearing these stories through the images is incredible and important for proximity. But yeah, I'll send all of these out. Scott, you've been in this movement a long time, and I know that is exciting and thrilling and weighty and weighs on you. So one, just thank you for your work, for capturing this. I think this gives people a view and an experience that so many would not otherwise have. So one, just for the over 20 years of engaging this and the cost that has brought to you, thank you for that. And thank you for coming today and talking and sharing with us all of this. I've admired you from afar for a while, and I'm so glad to be able to hear some more of the story, and now be able to pass even more of this and get more specific with people as we talk about the story. So thank you, friend, very, very much.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. I really appreciate it.
Well, friends, in the next day or so, I'll send out a recording. Again, I'll send out all of these links and make sure that you can keep up with Scott and his work and things happening within the movement. But Scott, thank you again. Thank you to everyone who's been here, and blessings on your day. Thank you all very much. All right. Bye-bye.